Hello, I'm John, and this is Sound Reaction. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a record stop sound effect that can be applied to any sample in Sampler. It should sound something like this. Alright, so let's get started. To get started, we're going to need a MIDI track that's going to hold our sampler instrument that's going to trigger our audio file. So let's hit Command-Shift-T to add a new MIDI track. We're then going to insert the sampler instrument on that MIDI track, and we're going to load in the sample or audio file that we want to work with. In this case, I'm just going to use a built-in sample in Ableton. And we'll have a quick listen once I map the MIDI note. I'm going to double click and add a blank MIDI clip into this MIDI slot, MIDI track, and I'm going to add a note on C3. This happens to be a 2-bar loop, so I'm just going to stretch this out to 2 bars. And now when we hit play, we can hear our loop and our audio file playing. A couple of things that we want to get set up here in Sampler before we go any further is we want to set our filter global section to off. We want to set our volume to 0, our initial volume to 0, and if you want a little bit of extra release, you can put that in here so that it's got just a slight fade out. It doesn't come to a quick stop. Additionally, we want to make sure that our sample is mapped to the root note of the note that we added on the MIDI track. So in this case, C3 is our root note, and C3 is set as our root note here. This is going to ensure that the sample plays back at the right pitch and tempo. So now that we're able to trigger our audio, we need to tell our audio to create a record stop. And to do that, we're going to adjust the transposition value under the pitch oscillator tab of the sampler. And to do that, we need to create another new blank MIDI clip. So let's do that. Command-Shift-T creates another MIDI track. And I'm going to double click to add a blank MIDI clip in that track. And I'm going to make sure that I have my MIDI output set to my IAC driver bus. The first thing we need to do to control this transposition value in Sampler is to tell this MIDI clip to output some control change data. That can be found underneath this Envelopes tab. In this Envelopes tab, I'm going to make sure MIDI control is selected, and I'm going to choose something other than pitch bend. In this case, controller 20, which is currently set as undefined. Once we have that, we can double click in our region and drag all the way up to 127. The length of this region is going to depend on the length of our record stop sound effect. So I'm just going to stretch it out a couple of bars to make the effect super obvious. Once we have our control data starting at 127 at bar 1, we can click somewhere towards the end and fade it out down to 0. The next thing I want to do is actually bring this data back up towards the end of the clip to reset the transposition to 0. In order for this to work, we're going to have to now map this controller data to the transposition. And to do that, we need to go into MIDI map mode, which is Command-M, and we need to start our MIDI clip playing. We can hear the transposition's already in effect, but we're going to override that. So Command-M to get into MIDI map mode, and then click Transposition. Once you have this mapped, you can try to play your sample. But first, we need to adjust the scale of our transposition. Right now it's set to a minimum value of -48 steps. So basically when this control point of transpose sees a MIDI controller value of 0, it's going to set it to -48 steps. But when it sees a value of 127, it's going to set it to +48 steps. And we actually want this to be 0. We want this to be 0 steps so that it resets at its original tempo. Let's have a listen. And I'd say that's a pretty good record effect. Right now, this MIDI clip is set to loop, so it's going around and around. So we really only want this to play once, so we're going to hit loop off. I'm just going to check my settings on Sampler to make sure my transposition is restarting at the correct value. And it's playing back too slow because I'm on D3, not C3. Let's try that again. Alright, now let's trigger our record stop effect. And there goes our transposition. And it's then reset that transposition back to 0. The second thing we want to do is we want to tell this clip slot containing sampler to stop after the record effect. So to do that, I'm going to create another blank MIDI clip. And this time, instead of working in the envelopes tab, I'm going to work in the notes tab. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom to C-2 and insert a note. Once I do that, I can start playback of the note, then go into MIDI map mode, and click my clip slot stop button. So let's do that. Okay, so it has picked up the MIDI note C-2 on the clip stop button. We can exit MIDI map mode, and we can even get rid of this MIDI note on this clip slot because we're going to add it into the same clip slot as our transposition control change. Instead of being on the envelopes tab, we want to go over to the notes tab, scroll to the bottom, and place our MIDI note somewhere after our control value change. In order to make sure that our MIDI note is happening after our control value change, we can go back to our envelopes tab, and we can see that we have our control value change down to 0, and then C-3 note, and then back to 0. So I'm just going to adjust this ramp a little bit, and let's have a listen. Alright, so we've got our record stop effect. It's then stopping the clip and resetting our transposition back to 0. So if we play this clip again, it starts at the right pitch and speed. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for other videos, please leave them in the comments and I'll be sure to get to them.